Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, where we aim to get the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. I'm Todd Landman. In this series, the Rights Track is on the road, capturing the voices, experiences, and knowledge of people around the world who are part of the global coalition to end modern slavery by 2030. In today's episode, we are stateside at Yale and Harvard universities, where I've been talking to two eminent academics involved in the study of slavery about what lessons we learn from history that can help with the fight to end slavery today. David Blight is the class of 1954 professor of American history and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. And John Stauffer is professor of English and African American Studies and American Studies at Harvard. I started by asking David Blight why, in his latest book, a definitive biography of Frederick Douglass, he refers to the American abolitionist as the prophet of freedom.
Thank you, Todd. It's great to be with you. During the course of many years of working on Douglass, and especially the 8 to 10 years I spent on this biography, more and more, I found myself trying to understand why and how Douglass was so deeply steeped in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament, and especially the great stories of the Old Testament, and from the prophets, especially Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Ezekiel. And with time, I found myself wishing I had an entire year off to do nothing but read theology, but I didn't have that year off. What I did have are a few friends who are theologians, and they told me many things to read after they laughed at me when I asked them, what do I read on the Old Testament? Which is hilarious to an Old Testament scholar. But they told me to read people like Robert Alter and Walter Bruggemann. And a rabbi friend of mine particularly told me to read Abraham Heschel, the great Jewish theologian. And the reason I wanted to tackle this problem, and the reason that word ends up in this title of the book, is because I do believe Douglass became that kind of genius with words, a master of language, like prophets of old, like the Hebrew prophets, who could find phrasing, who could find sentences and paragraphs at times to explain to us what's going on, to explain a catastrophe, to explain a tragedy, to explain a pivot in history, or to explain a victory or a triumph. When people read Douglass, they find, whether it's in his short form editorials, or it's his long autobiographies, or in the speeches in particular, they often find there are phrases, there are paragraphs, there are passages in his writing and in his speaking that just capture what's happening to America, what's happening with the slavery crisis, what's happening with emancipation, what's happening with the aftermath of emancipation, what's happening with lynching toward the end of his life. He had that capacity with words to explain what's happening to us. And I go back again to this writer, Abraham Heschel. Heschel wrote a book in the 1950s called The Prophets, and he spends many pages defining what a prophet actually was in the Hebrew Old Testament tradition, but also what a prophet is through time. And among the many things Heschel said is that a prophet is that person who can find words and speaks words one octave higher than the rest of us actually understand, but can speak those words that stun us, and Heschel also said, at times can shatter us, which is the function of a prophet if you think about it. A prophet is not that person who predicts things. We misuse the idea of the prophetic. The prophet is the person who troubles us, who takes us to the depths of our condition, who takes us to the depths of our tragedies, and makes us troubled, and sometimes may even show us how we are perhaps about to be destroyed before we can ever be renewed. And that is a huge theme in the language and the words and the writing and in the life of Frederick Douglass. And that's why finally I got confident enough to use this word prophet in the title, and I realized that if you use that word, it's a big word, you have to be prepared to defend it.
Yeah, and that sense of disruption, I think, is important. And as a musician, I quite like this notion of speaking at an octave higher than where people are listening. That is a beautiful construction. I want to think about that. So if what you say is true, and I have no reason to doubt this, in what way are the words of Douglass relevant to the contemporary struggle against what's now being called modern slavery? And is there a Douglass amongst us who's leading the charge?
I don't know if there's a Douglass amongst us, because that would put perhaps an undue burden on someone.
On that person,
perfectly
yes.
frank. In American baseball terms, that's always like saying he's the next Mickey Mantle or the next Babe Ruth or something. There's only one Babe Ruth, and there may be only one Douglass. His resonance today is in so many issues, so many legacies of slavery. Every time we are debating birthright citizenship, the nature of equality and inequality, equality before law, whenever we are debating whether the carceral state in America, our mass incarceration of people, is a form of slavery. If one wants to find the primer for this, if one wants to find the best prior example of a person who had more to say on these questions than anyone, it is Douglass. And I'd also add to that we have so many examples now, it seems to me, in the last 50 years especially, in the world and in the United States, of leaders who had once been radical activists, radical outsiders, who then through time find at least partial, if not complete, victories. Think of a Nelson Mandela, a John Lewis in the United States, and a host of other civil rights leaders who became mayors and senators and congressmen and governors. What happens to that radical outsider who becomes, with time, because he lives long enough, the political insider?
Yeah.
Now, Douglass never became a complete political insider. He never held elective office, but he did hold 3 bureaucratic appointive offices, and he did indeed become a Republican functionary, a Republican Party functionary in the last 30 years of his life. But he lives that trajectory from outside radicalism, always beating down the doors and never inside of power, through an Armageddon of a civil war that leads to emancipation. He experiences the victory of his cause, or seems to, in his 40s. In the middle of his life, but he's going to live another 30 years to the 1890s to see most of those victories slowly but surely being erased and betrayed. And then what does the old radical who's become the political insider do? And at the very end of his life, of course, his last greatest speech in the last 2 years of his life was about the question of lynching, which by the early 1890s had become the most obvious, pertinent, and awful question about American race relations. Was the country heading into, a new kind of slavery? He dies at a time when people were asking, is the country creating a new, a kind of neo-slavery with sharecropping and with the early Jim Crow laws, and with the terror and violence that's going on? But I'd come back to Douglass in words. You and I wouldn't even be discussing him if it weren't for the majesty of his language. He wrote millions of words in thousands of speeches, hundreds of editorials, 1,200 pages of autobiography. He was a man of words. He was the kind of intellectual we've all known, and we may even be like this ourselves. He didn't know what he really thought until he could write it, until he would write it down. If there was a crisis of the moment, and he lived through dozens and dozens of them, he'd go to his desk and he'd craft a speech. And most of his speeches were crafted. They weren't just spontaneous brilliance off the beautiful tongue. He crafted them. And when he went to his desk to try to explain what this issue is or that issue is, whether it's the fugitive slave crisis or the Dred Scott decision, or it's emancipation in the midst of civil war, or it's the black exodus to Kansas after the war, or it's the Reconstruction issues, he left us prophetic language. He left us ways to understand this greatest of American problems, the problem with slavery, race, and their afterlives.
So for people today, let's accept there may not be a Douglass, but for people today who are fighting human trafficking, modern slavery, exploitation, precarity, all those sorts of issues, out of the millions of words from Douglass, what would be the key words they might want to just hold on to?
Well, my own favorite passage, there are many. I mean, the one most widely known, perhaps, is without struggle there is no progress, there never was and there never will. Power never concedes anything without a demand. It never did and it never will. You can take that idea into the future, into universal use. It fits any social movement ever known to humankind. It's why that quote survives. But my own favorite line by Douglass, among thousands, is the last sentence of his second autobiography, written in 1855. And keep in mind, he publishes My Bondage and My Freedom, that second autobiography, right in the midst of the 1850s, in the midst of the great political crisis over slavery and its expansion, while bleeding Kansas, a border civil war is breaking out, there are fugitive slave rescues going on in the country, and the whole world seems to be reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. He plants that autobiography in that moment, and the last sentence has this phrasing in it. He says, as long as heaven allows me to carry on this work, or to fight this fight, he says, I will fight it with my voice, my pen, and my vote. My voice, my pen, my vote. The reason I love that passage is it's his own choice of a way to end the story of his life when he's still only in his 30s. But he's discovered the vote. He's become a political abolitionist. He's become an abolitionist who believes you can only destroy slavery now by bending wills and somehow changing laws, whatever it takes. But it's also just about all any of us have today. Unless you have great wealth or great power, elective power, what else do any of us have but a voice, a pen, and a vote? And most of us don't even have the pen because most of us don't or can't write for the public. A voice, a pen, and a vote. I love using that passage too with young people. I hope they can think about all three parts of it. And again, if you think about it coming from a Douglass who has just written this 300 and some page autobiography without a day of schooling in his life, and he'd never made a living really doing anything but with his voice and his pen, they become precious words. They become words that are like natural ore out of the earth, which was a way Douglass thought about the whole natural rights tradition. His voice, his pen, his vote.
That was David Blight talking with me at Yale University. I also spoke with John Stauffer at the 400-year-old Harvard University campus and asked him to share his thoughts on whether and how lessons from previous movements to abolish slavery are being harnessed for what has been described recently as the fourth wave of an anti-slavery movement.
One of the most powerful weapons that the abolitionists had was a voice, in the largest sense of being able to articulate a voice that highlighted the degree to which slavery is about dehumanizing or an attempt to dehumanize another human being. That slavery never exists without violence or the threat of violence, and that it strips away all rights of that other individual. And at that time, when it was chattel slavery, legally treated that person as a piece of property. And the power of a voice, whether it's orally or written or an image that can circulate, has extraordinary power. And it did then, and it continues to today. It's why when William Lloyd Garrison first started publishing The Liberator, which was not the first, but the most influential, the first influential abolitionist newspaper, in the sense that Garrison recognized that he wanted to disseminate it as far and as wide as possible, and he sent it into the South, he sent it throughout the United States. It follows on Freedom's Journal, which is an African-American newspaper, but didn't have the funding. And frankly, at that point, there wasn't the technology available to produce the kind of newspaper at the cost that Garrison could. A lot changed in a few years during this period. The upshot was that even Southerners were so threatened by the Liberator that John C. Calhoun was able to pass a federal law prohibiting the circulation of the Liberator into the southern states. And he tried to pass a federal law prohibiting the circulation of any kind of imagery that could be construed as anti-slavery.
So is this voice an authentic voice, which is to say slaves themselves articulating a demand, or is it a voice on behalf of them, articulated by someone else?
It could be both.
Okay.
So the abolition movement was, scholars now recognize, as the first civil rights and the first human rights movement. It's the first organization in U.S. history that was truly, thoroughly integrated at all levels. Meaning that, and it was integrated not just between blacks and whites, but between men and women. The women's rights movement was part of the abolition movement, in which you treated every human as an equal. And so for the black and white abolitionists, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Liberty Party recognizes the crucial importance of having blacks as important members, but they didn't rely exclusively on them. If there was a white who could also speak truthfully about his own or her own experience interacting with blacks or meeting a fugitive or a former slave, that experience could be as powerful as a slave himself.
Now, in the age we live in with social media, email, rapid communications, there's an argument that there's a logic of connective action. One of the
Correct.
problems around social mobilization is that it's difficult to sustain it. There's a collective action problem, that the incentive for any one person to be involved in a collective movement for a public good around human rights, environment, nuclear war, or ending modern slavery is that the calculation that your individual contribution actually leading to a difference is very small, and therefore the incentive to be involved in any sustained way is quite low. However, with social media, etc., staying in contact with people through communications, through technology, etc., then you lower that sort of cost, and people remain engaged and participate. But historically, there was no internet. There was,
correct.
Communication was slow. So in this notion of voice networks, how did abolitionism historically maintain the momentum? How did it keep mobilizing people and keep the movement going?
So through the number of venues. One is it was the golden age of oratory, and public speaking then was similar to a professional athletic event or a rock concert or hip-hop concert today. People would come from miles around just to hear a good public speaker. And so to be hired as an abolitionist orator, you had to show that you were very talented as an orator, that you could attract a crowd and hold a crowd, whether you were white or black, and especially if you were black and could speak firsthand, as Frederick Douglass did. We now know that he was not only the most photographed American, but in David Blight's new book, arguably or possibly more Americans witnessed or firsthand saw Douglass speak than any other figure. And this would total in the millions. I mean, he would be the kind of Muhammad Ali.
But he had to physically be present because there was no modern technology to broadcast.
But still, so there's no modern technology to disseminate in the way you have the internet and Facebook and all kinds of media today. But still, he and a comparatively small number of other blacks and whites transformed the nation. So for every scholar will acknowledge that the abolitionists, meaning those who advocated an immediate or swift end to slavery and also advocated equality, democratic rights, equal protection under the law, amounted to no more, at most 5% of the population. And through this, until the Civil War had broken out already. At most 5% of the population. And so it is accurate that a lot of abolitionists, they didn't convert the masses into abolitionism, but they might have converted them into anti-slavery, meaning that, yeah, slavery is wrong. I'm not willing to sacrifice my profession and my downtime and devote every energy to anything, but I think it's horrible and should be ended. But maybe if it takes 20 or 30 or 40 years, that's okay. But that's still a partner. And they recognized that even if they weren't radicals, they were liberals and recognized the importance of it ending it. Ultimately, they're still a team player.
And so I guess the final thing I want to ask you then is there's a big critique around the lineage and the connection between the struggle against modern slavery, the use of the word modern slavery, the term modern slavery. And so in your mind, what's the safe set of connections one can make between historical slavery, transatlantic slavery of the kind that the United States experienced, and this struggle against modern slavery? What's the risk of, appropriating the language of slavery in a current abolitionist struggle? Where do you see the limits of the current abolitionist struggle in trying to reach and use the language from the past?
I think there are very few, if any, limits. I think there are virtually no limits. I think, and I've argued both in talks and in print, that history is the activist muse. And if we don't learn from the past and use the past, it will come back to haunt us. And the specific connections between historical slavery and modern slavery are ones I've already suggested. One is slavery is defined by the threat of violence against another person, being held against their will and forced to do work at no pay. And without violence, or the threat of violence, slavery cannot exist, period. And coupled with that, and slave owners recognize this then and now, coupled with that is denying that slave a voice. Because even if you use violence or the threat of violence, force him or her to work against his or her will without pay, if you give him a voice, you're not going to keep him. Silence is one of the great weapons of slave owners, then and now. And so the more one can speak out, the more one can bear witness to these atrocities that are very similar to the atrocities of over 100 years ago. The more you bear witness, the swifter that voice, that collective voice, will mobilize government at the both national level and the local level to take action and to end it.
Professor John Stauffer, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington. You can find out more about our podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for our Modern Slavery series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary slavery experts and the world's first large-scale research platform for ending slavery.